to Serger Jewelry, who needs Tiffany's. I'm Gail Yellen of Gail Patrice. Welcome to Serger Jewelry, who needs Tiffany's. I'm Gail Yellen of Gail Patrice Design, and I'm so excited that you're joining me because you can have your own little custom jewelry store in your sewing studio. Between your serger and sewing machine, you can create all sorts of fun little bracelets, and we're going to show you that today. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about how I started making serger bracelets. I was actually using my belt loop binder for a tote bag strap. And while I was making it, I just happened to take the strap and wrap it around my wrist to take a look at it. And then I thought, hey, this would make a really cute bracelet. And that's what kind of got me started on the Serger Jewelry. And once I started making one, I started making tons of them. So I want to share that with you and show you a few different variations using the belt loop binders and your sewing machine. These are the two belt loop binders that we'll be using, and there is a wide one and a narrow one. This is the 1.5 inch belt loop binder, and that gives a finished strip of about 1 inch wide. This is the 3/4 inch belt loop binder, and the finished width of that strip is about 1/2 inch. Now, the important thing to do before you go to your actual fabric is to make a test and be sure that your stitching is centered correctly. Before we start making our bracelets, let's talk about some of the different fabrics that you can select for this. Your choices are not quite endless, but there are a lot of varieties that you can pick from. I've used denim, cotton, linen, blends of things, rayon challis. I've even used ITY knits. But while I'm talking about the ITY knits, I have an example to show you. When I tried to run the ITY knit through the belt loop binder just by itself, it did not behave well. I couldn't really get it to stitch nicely. So I fused on some fusible interfacing. This is Denny Fuse, which is available on my website, but you can use some of your favorite fusibles as well. And that just gave it enough body and allowed it to behave well as it went through the belt loop binder. And it worked perfectly fine. So that is a solution if there's a knit that you particularly like and the color of or the print of or anything else. But the other thing is that you have to remember that it needs to feed smoothly through the opening on the front of the binder attachment itself. So if your fabric is really hefty and thick and it is straining to get through, you might want to select a different one because you do want it to feed smoothly so that your finished product looks nice. For the ends of the bracelets to finish off the short edges, there are a variety of things that you can use for that too. The craft stores have some of the metal closures that you can put on those, like little brackets, and those are great. But also you can use ultra suede, a light kind of flexible leather like a lambskin, something soft that your machine will go through easily, and something that doesn't fray will work well. So ultra suede, real leather, pleather, or some people call it vegan leather. There are a variety of things to use with that as well. So explore your options and make your choices. For a stabilizer, whether I'm doing tote bag handles or a bracelet, I like grosgrain ribbon. Grosgrain ribbon is fantastic. It's strong, it's very stable, and it's great inside the bracelets or tote bag handles. Now, for the wider belt loop binder, there are two widths that you can use. You can either use the 7/8 inch, which is my preference for tote bag handles, or a 5/8 inch wide grosgrain ribbon, and that's the one I typically use in bracelets. For the narrower belt loop binder, a 3/8 inch wide grosgrain ribbon works very well. Now, just going back to the 5/8 for a second, I had mentioned that the finished width of the wider binder creates a 1-inch strip. And this doesn't fill it out from edge to edge, but it doesn't make any difference. The stitching is caught in the ribbon, and it provides plenty of stability. Before we do our actual bracelet construction, let's take a look at some of the things we'll need for it. Here are some of the other things that we'll need as well. You'll need one or both of your belt loop binder widths. You'll need the little fixing screws to put it onto your machine. You want nice fresh needles to work with. I like to stabilize the inside of my bracelet strips with grosgrain ribbon. I have a 5/8 inch width for the wider binding strip and a 3/8 inch for the narrower one. Closures. I like to use either velcro dots. Those are the quickest ones to work with. You can sew on snaps on either end. Let's take a look at the other edge of this one. Here they are. Here's the other end of that. You can buy these little metal brackets in your local craft store and the lobster claw, and you might need a little jump ring to put on so that you can attach it onto that bracket. If you're using ultra suede or leather or other fibers for the edge of to finish off the ends of your bracelet, you might want some temporary spray, because what I like to do is spray the wrong side of that, fold it over, give it a nice firm finger press, and then I can zigzag the edges without having to manage them. Also, if you're joining layers with a narrow belt loop binder on top of the wide one, you also might want to use some Wonder Tape to hold that in place. Again, it manages it and you don't have to worry about it. Before you go to the fabric that you're going to create your bracelet with, it's always important to test it on a sample strip first. And you can see this is about 22 inches long. But when I first started using the belt loop binders, I used to cut my fabric strips about 45 inches long, because it would take me a bunch of different little adjustments to get my stitching centered correctly. This is just a lightweight cotton, and this is about 1 3/4 inches wide for the wide belt loop binder. And I have a 1-inch strip for the narrow belt loop binder. And you can see at the end on both of these, I've cut a little arrow, and that just makes it easier to feed into the binder itself. It just makes it feed through more quickly. And I use something kind of skinny to sort of push it along. And I don't know, let me just see if I can pull this up so that you can see. You'll notice that both edges fold to the underside, and that's again why we want to make sure our stitching is centered, so that it catches both of those edges underneath. And I'll show you once it's stitched what it's going to look like, but that's just a quick idea. I've pretty much got this dialed in, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So we'll go to the machine and I will just show you the little nuances of how to get it centered. One other thing worth noting before we go to the machine is these little silver screws. When they come from the factory workers always have these screws in the most forward position, right across from the mouth of the binder. And if you put this on your machine with this in that position, oftentimes the front of this bumps into the toe of your presser foot. So before I put this on the machine, I loosen up both of the screws and I take one out. I slide it back 1 or 2 positions. There are, I think, 4 hole positions in this. But just slide it back and then tighten the screws back up. Put them both in so that it doesn't torque side to side. And just a note of caution, these screws are very shallow. So make sure you do this over a table so that they don't disappear and roll away on you. But I just wanted to mention that because a lot of times people don't realize that they can reposition these, so that's a good tip to know. Let me give you the setup on the machine. I have my cover hem table on, and you can see these two sets of screw holes. I'm going to attach the belt loop binder to this back set of screw holes. And I have the clear foot on just for the video because it'll make it easy for you to see what's going on under the foot as I stitch along. I have serger cone thread in both of my needles. I have it in my chain looper. My differential feed is on N, your machine might say 1, and my stitch length is on about 2.5, and that is a variable setting depending on the type of fabric and the thickness and the look that you're going for on your stitching. I have my left and right cover stitch needles in, so I'm set up for a wide cover stitch. If you wanted to do this with 3 needles in for a triple cover stitch, you can do that too, but this will give me the same width as a triple cover stitch, just missing that 1 needle and thread. I'm putting the belt loop binder on now, and I have my little screws that'll go into these screw holes in the table of the machine. And I just put those in loosely to begin with, and then kind of eyeball to make sure that the front of this belt loop binder is sort of centered with those needle positions. And again, the true test will be looking at how the stitching looks on the test strip of fabric. So I'm just tightening these up. And you do want to be sure to use both of the screws so that if you just have one in, it will allow the binder to wiggle around. So you want to make sure that it's nice and steady. So now we're ready to feed the fabric in and give it a test run. My needles are up and my presser foot is up, and now I'm putting my test strip in. And when you're putting in your actual fabric, you want to make sure that the right side is face up, and I'm just easing this along with my tweezers. And as always, in cover stitch mode, you want to be sure to start with the fabric under your needles. And you can see that this doesn't look like anything great yet, but you'll see how it straightens out. And when you're doing your fabric for your bracelets, always cut your strips at least 6 inches longer than you'll need, because typically the beginning and end of the fabric strips doesn't always look picture perfect, but you can chop those off for your finished length of your bracelet, and it doesn't make any difference at all. So I am going to put my presser foot down. We'll start stitching, do a few inches, and then see whether the stitching looks, whether it's centered or not. And if not, we'll just stop and make a little adjustment. And the rule of thumb on that is if your stitching's too far to the left on your fabric strip, you'll loosen these screws and move the binder attachment to the left. If your stitching's too far to the right, loosen the screws, move it to the right. And it's a very subtle adjustment. So let's step on the gas and stitch along and see how the stitching looks. And I'm trying to keep my little strips kind of centered in here. And sometimes with the actual fabric, I think that I like to keep my finger on top so that it doesn't pop up through the middle. This is just one of those dumb luck times when the first try, my stitching looks pretty centered. But if you knew how many times I've done this, you'd understand why it was pretty easy to get that. So, and you'll get good at it too, but most of the time I still need to make 1 or 2 adjustments at least when I am testing the stitching position. So I'll just stitch through this and I'll show you the back side or the bottom side of this. And this attachment is so cool because it's doing all the work. I'm just basically stepping on the gas to let it go. But when I mentioned wanting to catch both edges of my fabric underneath, you can see the fabric meets in the middle and the stitching, the needles are catching both edges as they are folded under. We're all set up still with the wide belt loop binder, and we're going to do a fun denim bracelet. And this is basically going to be the foundation for a layered bracelet with the narrow belt loop binder. So here is my 5/8 inch grosgrain ribbon, and just as a little bit of information on the width of the ribbon, you can either use the 5/8 inch wide, or you can even use a 7/8 inch wide, but I think the 5/8 is pretty good for a bracelet. So I am going to bring that in, get that ribbon under the needles, and turn my hand wheel to use that as my third hand to keep it anchored, because I am going to have the denim in right side up, and that's going to wrap around this and keep the fabric nice and smooth, and also keep it from stretching. It keeps it very rigid. It's a great way to stabilize the fabric. And even if you're cutting something on the bias, which is a stretchy grain line, the grosgrain ribbon will stabilize it beautifully. So this denim is a little stiff, but I'm working that in. Now, the fabric does not have to go under the needles right away, because I already have the grosgrain ribbon under there. But you want to push it forward enough so that the feed dogs can grab it to help advance it as it's stitching through. And even without putting my presser foot down or stitching, already you can see how the fabric is wrapping around that grosgrain ribbon. So that's really a cool little thing. Before I start stitching, one other thing I wanted to mention, and it didn't happen this time, but sometimes when you're pushing the fabric through on top of the ribbon, it has a tendency to push the ribbon forward too. So before you start, what I like to do is, before I have the foot down, just pull back on that ribbon if it's kind of bunched up. But as I said, this time it didn't happen. So I'm just going to put my finger right on top of that opening on the binder and start stitching. And basically the ribbon takes care of itself. I'll give this a quick press with my iron, but you can see this is considerably, if I wrap this around my wrist, you can see how much longer it is and bigger. But this is what I mean about being able to chop off the beginning and end of the strip if it doesn't look picture perfect. I've got plenty there to work with for my ribbon, or for my bracelet. Well, now we're ready to finish off either end of the bracelet, and this is the simplest way to do it. We've got our nice long strip, and as I mentioned before, it's plenty long for my wrist. So we're going to chop off some on either end. Now, when you're measuring that, how you want it to fit is your preference. I don't like mine super tight, but I also don't like them super loose either. So just a comfortable circumference is good for me. And you want enough so that when you turn it over, one edge has at least, I'd say, about a 1/2 inch overlap with the other one, just for security. And we're going to use little Velcro dots to close this. And I think a 1/2 inch is probably pretty good. So I'm going to put this around my wrist and kind of find, I'm going to put my wrist down on the table and kind of find that happy spot. And I think that's probably about a good length right where my thumb is. So I will just cut that. I'm going to cut it straight across, kind of perpendicular. And remember, I talked about cutting it longer so that you could chop off either end. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So I've got a nice, clean bracelet edge. I have a couple of little strips of ultra suede, and I sprayed the wrong side with a temporary adhesive spray. You can use KK2000, 505 spray. You could even use fabric glue. But one thing with fabric glue, and there are all different brands around, is that so that you don't gum up your needles, make sure it's dry before you go and stitch it down at your sewing machine. So what I have done is, as I said, I've got the adhesive on the wrong side. I'm putting about, this is cut maybe about 1 inch wide, and I put the bracelet and about halfway up and then flip the edge over and leave the edges of this ultra suede raw because it's not going to go anywhere. And so that stabilizes it. It's much wider than I need right now. But what I'm going to do is go to the sewing machine and just zigzag that onto the bracelet band itself. And then once it's all secured with the stitching, I'm going to cut off the excess width. We're all zigzagged on. I used a stitch width of 2.0 and a stitch length of 2.0. And the reason I cut these longer, it was strictly for ease of handling. Sometimes if you've got little tiny pieces that are just the width of whatever you're attaching it to, it just makes it a little bit harder to handle. And I can start and end the stitching off of the bracelet itself. So that was the only reason behind that. So now I'm ready to trim these right down to the same width as the bracelet, just like that, and just like this. You don't want to cut into your bracelet, just be careful. Just like that. So it looks great once it's all trimmed. And just like this. Perfect. We can throw these away. We don't need those anymore. Get rid of my little threads here. Okay, so now the quickest way to finish these off to make them stick is with little Velcro dots. And these are readily available in a hardware store, or I think they also sell them in some of the fabric stores and craft stores as well, so that you can find them. And I like to use just kind of a half round dot, just like this. And so you're going to use one with the soft side and one with the, I guess, the rougher side. So you have to kind of decide which one you want where. And I tend to like to have the rougher one on the top, simply because that way I know it's not going to contact my skin at all. So I'm on the wrong side of my bracelet, and this is very sticky, and I'll give you a little hint for stitching this on. But I'm going to put this on this side of my bracelet, but because it has to come over to the right side, I'm going to put the soft side of that Velcro dot on the top side of this. So they're going to be opposite sides of the bracelet. So I'm going to just cut this little dot in half. Same thing. And this one. And I put the straight edge toward the straight edge of the end of the bracelet, just like this. So here's my one half. There's the other half right down here. And then these attach like this. Now, originally, the first time I did this, I thought I was all done at this point. However, when you wear these bracelets a lot and you're pulling them on and off, eventually the stickiness of those dots doesn't last. So I suggest either taking a couple of little hand stitches in them or going to your machine. I use my sewing machine. And here's a little shout out for these special needles that became available within the last year or so. These are super universal needles, and they have a non-stick surface treatment on them. If you use a regular needle, because the adhesive on the Velcro dots is so gummy and sticky, I found that my needle got stuck right in it, and it wouldn't go up and down to stitch. I tried these super universal ones, and it went right through the dots perfectly fine. So those are kind of nifty to use, and they have kind of a dark finish on them. You can see they're not shiny the way regular needles are. And I think that is the coating that is used to keep it from sticking. So just if you see them, there's nothing wrong with the needle itself. That's just the way the coating works on it. So you can just take a few stitches through the either end of those Velcro dots and you're all set. We've completed our first most basic bracelet using the wide belt loop binder. Now it's time to kick it up a notch. On this bracelet, we have 2 layers and we use both belt loop binders. We use the wider one with the black as the base, and then I used a really pretty print as the top layer using the narrow belt loop binder. And we'll also show you how to change out, instead of using the Velcro dots for a closure, we'll be using snaps on this one. And while we're talking about stitching, wait till you get to the embellishment section of this video class, because I'm going to show you how to use the chain looper side of your stitching as a beautiful embellishment. You are going to love it, because I think it's really cool to do, and it's easy and beautiful. Before we get started with our layering using the wide and narrow belt loop binders, I just wanted to show you on the test strip, because it shows up so well, the difference between using the wide cover stitch, which is perfectly fine, or if you want your stitching lines closer together, you can change your needle position to the center and right or center and left positions, whichever you prefer, and use the narrower, and you can see the difference in the width of the stitch. The only thing I would say to be sure of when you're using that narrow cover stitch is, because the stitching lines are closer together, you do have to be accurate so that you make sure you catch both edges underneath. And let me just show you that. And we mentioned earlier about using the test strips and moving your belt loop binder right or left to get your stitching line centered. And this is why I like to use a nice long piece, because you can see very clearly that this is the beginning, and it took me all the way down to almost the last 4 or 5 inches to get my stitching centered perfectly on that. So it does pay to have a nice long strip for your test, but I do have it all centered, so I'm ready to go. The number of possibilities with adding a top layer are infinite. Basically, you can use anything that you want almost. But let me show you a variation using the narrow as well as the wide belt loop binder, but using the same denim. I'll move this aside, and I've run off a couple of layers. This is the same as this one for the wide belt loop binder, but I ran off the same denim using the opposite side in the narrow belt loop binder, and we can add these together. And what I like to do, if I'm just using serger cone thread, not as a decorative element to do the stitching, I put the 2 chain looper sides together. And I'll show you, using one of my very favorite notions, Wonder Tape, how to make sure that it stays put as you stitch it down on your sewing machine. But this is the opposite side, and that makes a great look. For this section, I'm going to use my 2 layers of denim, and I've got them all stitched out. I haven't trimmed them down yet, because then I can decide which part looks the best. But here is one of my very favorite notions for sewing. It's Wonder Tape. It's a 1/4 inch wide, and you can get that in all the chain stores, and I'm sure your favorite independent dealer carries it as well. But it really is my go-to notion for putting in zippers. I never pin them, I never baste them. I always use Wonder Tape, and it's fantastic for this. It's a double-sided adhesive, and it's wash away. Now, I'm not going to probably be washing my bracelets, but if you're using it on zippers for a garment or anything else, certainly you don't have, or if you're doing a quick hem on something, you can do it for that. So I'm just putting this on, and it has a peel away layer of paper over the top. And the nice thing is that if you don't get your strip or whatever you're attaching, ribbon, whatever, centered or positioned exactly the way you want it to, you can always lift it and reposition. So I'm just going to give it a nice firm finger press, and then I'm going to peel the paper off. And I just get my nail under there to hold that on. So you can see the adhesive, and I don't need the paper anymore. And what I'm doing on this, because I'm not using the chain looper side of my stitching as a decorative element, I'm putting both of those layers together and centering the narrow strip on top of the wide one, just like this. And now, no pinning or anything else. I'm ready to go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to zigzag this on and probably use a stitch length of 2 and a stitch width of 2 to put this on. I've zigzagged on the narrow band to the wide band at the base, and I used a 2.5 stitch width and a 2.0 stitch length. And I used a very lightweight thread in my needle, 100 weight. It's very thin, very lightweight. And I use regular thread in my bobbin. But it's enough to hold this on. And one other point that I think is worth mentioning is that on the narrow band, because it's a double layer, I did not use grosgrain ribbon in this. I didn't need it to stabilize it. The base wide one is all stabilized with the grosgrain ribbon. So if you want to use it, you can. And if you don't want to use it, it'll be perfectly stable without it. Okay, let's finish this with snaps. I'm going to trim this down. I found that 7 inches long is a good length for my wrist. I'll trim it down. We'll put the ultra suede on the edges, and then I'll show you how I put the snaps on. I've attached my ultra suede ends on and I cut down my bracelet to size. And now we're going to use snaps for closures. And the principle of attaching these is exactly the same as what I said with the Velcro strips. That one side of the snap is going to go on this side of the bracelet, and the other one is going to go on the bottom side, so that when you attach them, they'll snap together. So I have a hand needle all threaded up with regular good old all-purpose thread, and I've got a double strand of it, and I can just pop on the first set of snaps. And this is just kind of a medium-sized snap. I'm not sure what the number is, but what I like to do is, you don't have to bring it through all of the layers. I'll just come through the ultra suede right on top, and I'm going to hide that knot under my snap. And these are really teeny tiny to have on camera, but I just get that first one kind of centered on my ultra suede. And if you put on a button or a snap on anything else, this is basically the same thing. I'm just not going to go through all of the layers. And I'll take probably 3 stitches in each hole. So here's my third one. And then I travel under the ultra suede to the next hole, just like that. And it makes it neat looking. I do like to keep it kind of tidy looking for the closure, just to have a nice professional look to it. We don't want a lot of tails and strings and stuff sticking out. So 1, 2, 3, and now I'm traveling under the ultra suede to the next hole. So you can see this is a pretty quick technique. 1, whoops, don't poke yourself. That hurts. 2, 3, and travel. And look, we're already at the last hole on this one. So I'm going to do this one, and then I'm going to do the opposite side. And I put 2 on because I don't think 1 is really quite enough. for this width bracelet. If you're doing a narrow bracelet, definitely you could get away with one snap on it, and we'll talk about that at another point. Okay, so this is this. And let me just show you how I like to end up my stitching just to secure it. So I come up for that last one. Then I have my loop, just like this, and I have it in my finger. I take my needle and thread, go right through that loop, hold that, pull that loop tight, repeat it again, one more time, nice and tight, and then a third and last time. Pull it nice and tight, and now I'm just going to bury that thread tail right under my ultra suede, right like this, like that, and then take my scissors, clip that thread tail, and it's a nice neat finish on that. So I'm going to re-knot my fabric, and I am going to do the other side of that same snap. And what I like to do on this is I'll take it just like this and kind of match it up, get those ultra suede pieces, and I like to press down on that little nipple part of the snap and see if I can get a nice little impression on the opposite side, which I can, and I don't think you'll be able to see it, but it's right here. And then I'm going to bring this side and center it right on that little impression and hand stitch it on the same way I did for the first side. Playing with prints on the using both belt loop binder sizes is really, really fun. And here's an example of two different ways using the same fabrics. On this one, I used the black solid fabric with the wide belt loop binder, and then I used this really cool print with the narrow belt loop binder on top. And I don't know if the camera can pick it up because this is such a busy print, but I used the triple cover stitch on this one. On this, I did exactly the opposite. I used the print with the wide belt loop binder and the solid black with the narrow belt loop binder. But again, you might be able to see on the black the triple cover stitch on this. Now, we'll show you using prints for top and bottom too, and a really cool little variation with that as well. This is a really cool rayon challis. I just love this. It's so bold. And you can see how there are different motifs that go horizontally on this. And they really invite you to change up some of those motifs. And that's exactly what I did. In fact, I cut this part off so you can't see it on the big piece. But it came from the same one. So I'm going to later on show you a wide strip taken from one part of the print, and then the narrower band taken from another part of the same fabric. So when you get these really nifty looking prints, you can play with that a little bit and make it your own little combination and have a lot of fun with it. I'm going to show you another way to create a serger bracelet, and this one is really, really fun. It's just kind of a wraparound, and you can make it as long as you want to do and wrap it as many times as you want. But also, you may wonder how all of those different colors showed up on the face of the bracelet, and that's using a really nifty little tool called a thread palette, and that allows me to blend multiple threads, and in this case I have 4 on it, and different colors come to the forefront as you stitch along and the thread goes through the machine. This wraparound bracelet is fun to make, and it's just a lengthened version of what we've been doing, but you can give it a very fun professional look with some of these little jewelry closures. All of these pieces are available in chain craft stores and probably even some of the larger sewing stores that have a craft or jewelry section would have these available. And these little end clasps that finish off the either end of the bracelet, I found them in 3 different widths. This is a 1/2 inch, which is absolutely the perfect width for this particular bracelet. They come in a slightly smaller one. I think it's about 3/8 of an inch, and also a longer one, which is 1 inch. And that one fit perfectly on this bracelet. So it's like they were made for me. And then I had this little chain, and I wanted small rings. I couldn't find really small regular jump rings, so I just pulled a link off of this chain to use to also attach the little lobster claw closure onto the end of these little brackets. So let's talk about the fabric and what I did for the stitching, because you're probably wondering about how I did that. This is corduroy, which I had never used before, but I happened to have some in my stash, and it was the color that I wanted to use, and I wasn't sure whether it would go through the belt loop binder easily or not, because it does have some thickness and a little bit of heft. It's a fine wale corduroy, but I did not use any grosgrain ribbon in this because it wouldn't go through with the grosgrain ribbon. But you can always try it if you have a slightly thinner or finer wale corduroy. It may go through fine, but it was just because I like the color. But I used the right side of the fabric as my wrong side, so that when I passed it through, all you saw was the smooth color on that. And when we go to the machine, I'll show you the setup with my thread palette, and I have 4 different colors in here and a couple of different weights of thread. So, and I used a narrow cover stitch, and I'll just talk about a couple of little adjustments that I made for the 4 threads going through my chain looper. Before I go to the machine and show you the thread palette and the threads that I have set up, I just want to give you a couple little pieces of information about it. And the first one is experimenting with different colors. You may want to cut multiple lengths of your fabric, because I fiddled around with about 3 or 4, maybe even 5 different threads before I hit on the color combination that I wanted. Also, on the weight of the threads, don't overwork your machine and overtax it. You'll be able to tell if your machine sounds like it's kind of straining and chugging along and it's having a hard time stitching. You may need to switch out one of the threads for a lighter weight one. And I'm not a fan of overworking the machine, simply because we don't want to break anything or ruin anything, which I never have, but that's why I stop. If it sounds like it's too much weight on the threads, then I'll back off and change them out a little bit, or even eliminate one. But I've got the corduroy all cut for the narrow belt loop binder. We are going to be set up for the narrow cover stitch with my center and right needles in. And we'll talk about stitch length and the tensions. I had to increase the tension on the needles almost to the maximum because I had the 4 threads in the chain looper. So when we go to the machine, I'll show you what I'm talking about. On this bracelet, on the strip of fabric, for the weights of the threads that I used on this, I used 2 12-weight threads and then 2 machine embroidery weight threads. So I tried hard not to overdo it on the weight of the thread. And that also will affect your stitch length. So we'll talk about that too. Before I put the fabric in and we do the stitching, let me just show you my setup. This is a thread palette, and it has 4 of these little pegs on it, so you can do up to 4 threads on this, but you can do fewer also. If you want to do 2 or 3, that's fine. And I have a 12-weight and a 12-weight, and these are my 2 embroidery weights. And on this one, I have a thread net, in case you're wondering what's poking out of here. And I have an earlier tip clip on how to put on the thread nets. But I find that with rayon threads, they have a tendency to kind of fall down and puddle and relax. And to avoid having them get caught and break, I put a thread net on, and then they'll feed smoothly. I brought it down. I bypassed the tension on the chain looper side and just brought it through this little bracket. I brought it down in through this bracket, and I used a little thread cradle to bring it in through the chain looper, because you want to thread all 4 threads at the same time, just like you do with 1 thread. And I'm set up for a narrow cover stitch, and I have serger cone thread in the needles, and those I used a thread that was pretty close to the color of my fabric. I cranked up my needle tension almost to the max to compensate for the weight of the 4 threads in the chain looper. I think I'm ready to close up the front of the machine, attach the belt loop binder, and get the fabric in and stitch out a sample to show you. I am all set up at the machine, and as I said, I am using the wrong side of the corduroy. Here's the right side. That's face down, so this is my right side for this particular technique. And I am all set to go, I think. Let me just double check my positioning on my stitching and see if I have to move this right or left. And you see how I didn't have my finger over here, and you see how it pops out? So, and this is a stiffer fabric. The corduroy is thicker. So that's why I do like to rest my finger there, just to keep the fabric where I want it to go, not where it wants to go. And I'm just doing a little peek test underneath, and it looks like the stitching is holding both sides. And again, using that narrow cover stitch, you have very little wiggle room for a mistake, so you do want to make sure you catch both edges, which it is. But if you want to switch to a triple or a wide cover stitch, try it out. It'll work. Okay, yep, nice. And I like, with the thread palette, I like a dense looking stitch. So I shortened up my stitch length to just a little below 3. But again, it depends on the weight of the fabric, or the weight of the fabric, the weight of the threads, the number of the threads, and the look that you want. So you can fiddle around with that. And my stitch length is about 2.8. This is just a portion of the strip that I just stitched, and I shortened it up to be about 4 inches long, just so that the camera could catch both edges. But let me show you how I finished the ends with these little brackets. Okie doke, we're all set to go for putting these little brackets on the end. And you can see, I think, one side has teeth in it that will grab the piece of fabric. Before I put one of the brackets on the end of the fabric strip, I want to attach this little jump ring to it. So I've got tweezers, and I opened it up with some needle nose pliers just to slide it onto this. And then I'm just going to grab my needle nose pliers and close that up again. And these are really teeny tiny, so it's kind of hard to handle them and for you to see it, I know. So I'm going to take this and just squeeze it to close it a little bit. It's pretty tight. That's good. Okay, and now I'm ready to pop this on the end of my fabric, and I've got the smooth side without the teeth on the right side. And I'm pushing the fabric right up to the little bend in the bracket, just like this. And the very first time I did this, I wasn't really paying too much attention to what I used to tighten this with. And all you're doing is squeezing it to get it tight. And for truth, here's what I used on my other bracelets: my Scotch tape holder. Because it's flat and I could clamp down. And now I'm just going to take my pliers and I'm going to go across the whole thing, because I don't want to create a dent. And I'm going to squeeze it to tighten it up. And you want to just tighten it as much as you can. And that's good. That's going to hold nice and snug. So it gives a really nice little finish to the end. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other end. And then we're going to put the little lobster claw. Well, actually, why don't we do that first? Before I close up this little ring, I want to slip my lobster claw on. And now I want to close up this little ring to hold it so it doesn't slip out. I'm just pinching those ends close together. Just tightening them up. I think that's nice and secure. So here's what the one end looks like. And then all we have to do is the same process and put the bracket on the second side. All right, I've got that second one in, and let me just give that a little crimp with my pliers. And as you can see, these are not jewelry pliers. They're just from downstairs. And I'm all set. And now if I had a really teeny tiny little wrist, I could get this on, but I wanted to make sure you could see both ends together. And there we go. So you can see it gives you a really nice little professional end. But I also want to mention that as far as determining the length of the strip that you're using, if you notice the lobster claw and the jump ring add some length to your bracelet. So you might want to take that into account too when you're deciding where to cut the length of the fabric strip. I have my 2 strips of fabric, and I've selected my beads that I want to put on it. And I've marked out the placement for them so that they're all even. And you can see the little bits of grosgrain ribbon peeking out the edges. The marks that are in the center are for the bigger beads, and the 3 that are a little more spaced on either side are for the small round beads that'll create the spacing. Here's my game plan for putting on the larger beads. There's 1 round one like a disc and 2 rectangles. And then we'll do 3 of the round beads on either side. And those little red marks will be my guide for placement. So that's basically what it'll look like when it's finished. And those will all be erased. That's done with a heat erasable pen. So I have a needle and thread, and you always want to check to make sure that your needle will go through the holes in your beads. You may need to get a beading needle that's very fine if you have very small holes in the beads that you're using. So that's something to check out. And you can use either beading thread or regular thread. I'm just using regular thread for this. I think it'll be fine. So on the wrong side, I'm just going to pull the thread through, and it's going to come out that very thin little edge. There's my friction pen, and that all those marks will be gone when I'm completely finished with the beading. Okay, I'm bringing that out. And now it's time to slip on the first bead. Pull it right against that one. And now I'm going to the second piece, and I'm going to match up my markings and bring it through just on the edge and pull it so that the bead touches both of the strips of fabric. I'm going to go pick up just a little bit of the slack to get it through the next direction. And again, I'm coming out right on that little edge of the first one. Don't catch your thread. And snug it up. Don't pull it so tight that it's puckering though. You just want to keep it nice and smooth. And that's why working flat on a table works pretty well. Picking up a little bit of the fabric edge bring it through the bead again, and we'll go through a few times. And now I'm just picking up a tiny bit of that side of the fabric strip, coming back through. Here we go. Yep, there it is, pulling it through. All right. And now I'm going to do one more pass through the bead. It's almost like sewing on a button. You're just going in a different direction though. Bring it down. And now I'm going to tie it off on the wrong side of my fabric strip. Make sure nothing is hung up. There we go. There, I had to pull that thread. I wrapped it around the strip by accident. No harm done. And I'm going to continue along in the same fashion for those other beading positions. Okay, this is just tying off, and I'm burying the thread tail on the wrong side right between the layers, and I'm going to clip the thread right against the fabric strip. And I like to do each bead separately because if by some chance one of the beads gets caught on something and it rips the stitching, you're not going to have to redo all of the other beads with it. You just have to do a repair on that single one. I have my 6 round beads all attached. Now I'm ready to do those center ones, and they all look good and they're all positioned and spaced equally. That's why those little marks are so helpful. And now for the big one, it's essentially the same thing, but we're not using it as a spacer. We're just putting it on top and attaching it to both strips of fabric. And I'm coming up from the underside, the wrong side, pull my double strand of thread through, put it through the holes in the center round bead. It's like a little disc. And these beads, I think it kind of has a very earthy look to it. They're really kind of pretty, it's like a tone on tone. And I like to bring my needle down so that as it's passing through the fabric, it's touching the edge of that bead, and it really minimizes how much thread you can see on the edge of the bead, and aesthetically, I think it gives it a nice look. I'll just pass through the bead the same way I did with the little round spacing beads, the exact same way 3 or 4 times, and tie it off on the back of the, or the wrong side of those fabric strips. I just want to show you a few different ways that you can change up the look of your bracelet. This is 2 narrow belt loop binder strips that I use a thread palette on for the stitching, but I used a monofilament thread and a narrow zigzag to join the 2 edges together. And then I did my beading on top, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The next one is the same fabric using 3 strips and a narrow zigzag with monofilament thread. And then I did the ends and all the beading, and here's a button underneath the center beads. We talked about that cool green fabric that had all the different motifs going on, and here's exactly what I did. I did a wide belt loop binder strip with plain black fabric right here. I put a narrow strip on top of it and zigzagged it on. Then I used two different or one other section of the green motif, and I did narrows and I zigzagged those to the black fabric. To give you an idea of how it's constructed together, this is exactly what I did. I hid the chain looper thread with the top strip here, and here are my two side pieces, just to make it easy for you to see exactly what's what. Let's take a look at how we do the bead on top of the button and do some of the surface beading also. Now, there are a couple of approaches that you can take on that. You can stitch them on, which I like to do, but if you hate hand stitching and beading, which can be fussy and time consuming, you can certainly use some of the great adhesives that are on the market, and there are a bunch of them, so you can check in your local craft store to see which ones that you like. This example has a button just by itself as a center focal point, and then a button on either side with a bead. So let's see how we do that. Here is the double layered denim bracelet that we made already, with the right side of the denim and the other right side of the denim on top of it. So the first step in determining where you're going to put your button is to find the center point. And I've marked that right here. And one thing I want to mention about that is that you do have to take into account the fact that you're going to overlap the ends. So in order to find that dead center, I snap it closed, fold it in half, and then I've got that center point marked. But let's open it up again. And I've picked out a mother of pearl button and a bigger bead to go on top of that. And so the first thing I like to do is just to secure the button itself. Now, sometimes people say, well, can you glue the button on? You can, but I think that we all know how to sew on a button, and it's just not that hard. And so I like to sew it on myself, and that way I know it's going to stay put. So I'm just finding where that center mark is underneath my button, lining the center of the button up with it, just like this. And I'm going to just take a couple of stitches through the button by itself first, just to secure it and keep it where I want it to be, just like this. And then we'll add the bead onto it. So just go through, just like sewing a button on a shirt. There's no trick to this at all. Just kind of snug it up a little bit. And I'm using a lightweight thread and a thinner needle because I want to make sure it goes through the whole of my bead. So I've got this pretty well secured. So I'm going to come up through one of my holes in my button, just like this. And now I can pop on my little bead. Pull that through. And I don't have to worry about managing both layers together. And the whole key to kind of hiding that thread and making it as difficult to see as possible so that it doesn't have a real thready look to it is just to bring your needle down right next to where the edge of the bead is, just like this. So I'm going to go through a few more times, again just like sewing a button on, but now we've got two layers. I'm going to go through and sew that on, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's all finished. Our center button and bead are all secured. They're all sewn on. So now let's add some beads and doodads along here too. And I've threaded a second needle, and this time I put in a lighter color, kind of a neutrally tan or taupe color, just to minimize the thread showing. But again, that's your choice, and it also depends on the color of the beads that you're using and the look that you're going for. So this is kind of a random thing. When I first started making these bracelets, I honestly used to agonize about the placement of every single bead. And guess what? What I found is that when the whole thing was beaded, everything looked great. And it was just a kind of a mashup of different shapes, sizes, and different finishes on the bead. So I've got this little tray. And just to show you what I'm talking about with that, I've got some round beads. I've got, and this one is shiny. Here's one that's kind of a matte finish. I've got bugle beads that are shiny. I've got some that are matte. I've got these little wooden discs. And so I think it's kind of interesting and fun. And again, this is entirely your choice. But I think it's kind of nice when you mix up the different sizes, shapes, finishes, and what the beads are made of. I just think it gives it an interesting look. But again, depending on the look that you're going for, it's entirely up to you. So let's get going on this, and I'm not going to bead the whole thing on camera, but I will show a still of it when it's all done. But just to show you the process. So I just take a little starting stitch. I'll catch a few threads right here, and I'll pull it. And I've cut the tail under that knot very short because I don't want it to really show. And you'll see what I mean when I'm done with that. So I think to start off, since I have circles in the middle, I think I'll start off with a bugle bead. So I'm going to just sew this on. And what I'm talking about when I say to minimize the look of the thread, I just line that up and I'll bring my needle right down, right at the very edge of the bead and come out. And let me make sure you can see what I'm doing. So you really can't see any thread on top of that at all because I took that stitch right next to either end of the bead. And I'll go through this a few times and then move on to the next bead. And this part, I do have to hold it up so that I can get a look. And I don't like my beading thread super long, only because it can get tangled more easily. I'd rather rethread a few extra times, because if it gets tangled and you have to cut it off and start all over again, that's kind of a pain. So I'm going to just snug up that thread just like that and bring it down. And once it's, I've taken a couple of stitches through each one, I'll do about 2 passes on each bead and snug it up. So that's nice and secure. That's not going to move. So I can move on to my next bead. And I kind of like to cluster them a little bit, just in random directions. I'm not a professional beader, and I think sometimes if anybody who is a professional beader took a look at some of these things, they might be kind of surprised, but I think that the end result looks good, and really that's all that matters. So I'm going to pick this round bead and come through, and I'm going to put that right next to the other one. I'm going to bring this down, pull it, and snug it up, and I'm going to flip the bead just a little bit so that those openings are sideways so that you have a solid surface on top. And I'm pulling that thread fairly snug as I go through. And again, when I was talking about agonizing over every little bead, sometimes I'd sit there and fiddle with different colors and different things. And I do like to mix up the colors and shapes. But again, when the whole thing is done, it really pops and looks nice. So I've gone through that one twice. I'm going to come over here. And I think I'm going to do a yellow one that's kind of a triangular shape. And the opening will sit on top. And on that one, just to have it sit flat, I may go through it about 3 times just to have it stay put in the orientation that I like for it. Just like that. I'll come up, I'll go through another flat side, and that just keeps it oriented the way I want it to be. And I'm hoping you can see this. It's kind of hard with beading because my hand is in the way a lot. But when I first started doing this, I just did a little bit of experimenting. And everything stayed put, and that's the most important thing. So I've taken a stitch on all 3 sides. So you can kind of see how this motif is coming together on this. And I'll continue out on either side of this, adding the beads. But let me show you a little wraparound bracelet that I did just to give you an idea of how variety really makes the whole look of the beading pop. I'll put this one aside that I'm working on, and I'll continue along with that later. Here's a little wraparound one with the narrow belt loop binder and using that thread palette. You saw me do that one. And then I decided to do this beading on it, and I went the full length, but you can see the variety as I go along. I've got some little faceted crystals on here, little wooden discs, and then some with a bead on top of them, some without. But it's a pretty look. It's really nice. And these are not expensive beads. There's nothing about them that is dear or costly. And you can find some very, very nice beads in some of the big craft stores that are around. So don't think that you have to spend a lot of money on that. Also, there are some nice online sources as well. If you Google beading, you'll come up with a bunch of those. But I have found that the craft stores have really offered a lot of nice beads. Up next, couching fibers. I showed this one just a minute ago for the beading section, but you're probably wondering what all of this stuff is underneath here. This is the Irish linen. I've got the narrow belt loop binder strip here, the wide one here. But then what I decided to do was I have some fun chenille fibers that I thought would work well with this, and they're variegated. That's why you see the difference in the colors. And I just picked out a decorative stitch on my sewing machine and decided to couch these on. So we'll go over to the sewing machine and show you what we did. Here are the 4 fibers that I decided to add together. And 2 of them are kind of like a very thin cord. One is almost like a rayon embroidery floss. And this one is chenille, and I think that the difference in the textures is nice. Before you get started though, make sure that if your fibers have any wrinkles or kinks in them, flatten them out and smooth them out with your iron before you start, because they'll look much nicer. So let's head over to the machine and see how we couch these on. I'm at the machine and I have my clear open toe foot on. Now if you have a couching or a braiding foot, you can certainly use that, but if you don't have it, you can still do this technique and get a nice result. I would say before you get started though, create another strip that's exactly the same weight as your actual bracelet and test your stitch width, your stitch length, and your stitch selection as well. There are a lot of different specialty stitches that you can use to couch on with, so there's no limitation. The one that you're seeing in the video is certainly not the only one. There are tons of other ones, or even just like a 3-step zigzag would work. But that's your choice, and you can play around and experiment on your test fabric. So what I'm going to do is try to hold these together, and I just want to make sure that the width of the stitch grabs all of the fibers at once, and I've got them pretty well centered on this foot. So let me get going kind of slowly. And I think I might want to just widen that out to a 7mm stitch, just to give it another tiny little scooch of room to grab all of the fibers. And I'm just going down, I'm taking my time, and I want to try to keep my fibers centered on these, on the center strip as much as possible as well. If you go off a little bit here or there, guess what? No one's going to be able to tell. And I didn't mention it before, but before I finish off the ends of the bracelet, I want to get all this couching on because I want those raw edges caught in the end of the finishing strips on the end, the ultra suede or the leather, whatever you're using. And it doesn't matter if everything stays absolutely parallel and it's exactly the same. I think it's even more interesting if they kind of crisscross over each other a little bit in different places. This, though, I do want to show. One's right on top of the other, so. Okay. See how pretty that is? Here's the couching all complete, and one thing I forgot to mention at the machine is that the thread that I used for the couching is just regular all-purpose thread. I did not put a decorative thread in that was heavier or different than what I would use to do regular sewing. But if you want to use a decorative thread, by all means, go right ahead. Now I'm ready to clip the ends here, get my finished length, and put my leather or ultra suede on either end of the bracelet. I put my little finishing brackets on the end, tighten them up so they're nice and snug on this. And one thing I want to mention is when you do this with any of the fibers that you've couched on, make sure you catch all the ends underneath. You know, cut them long enough so that you make sure you do catch them under there. And I've added the little lobster claw and the tiny jump ring on this end, so I'm ready to wear this. And it's nice and clean on the back, just to give you a quick look at that. I promised you a bonus round, and this is a complete departure from what we did before, but I think it's really fun and you might like it too. This one involves memory wire, and you can again buy this right in a craft store, and it is memory wire. It stays coiled like this, and it's almost like a slinky, but not quite as flexible, but it stays coiled and will be in overlock mode for this with a rolled hem stitch. And what I did was I tried this out using the elastic foot that you use quite frequently for wire edge ribbon. But this particular memory wire was a little bit heavy, and because it's coiled and not straight, I found that I couldn't manage it as easily. You might have better luck using it with that foot. But what I did was I popped on my beading foot, and I used that, and I have decorative thread in my upper looper, serger cone thread in my right overlock needle, and in my lower looper as well. And when we go to the machine, I'll give you the complete setup for that. You'll set your machine up for a 3-thread rolled hem. So if you're not sure of your settings on your machine, double check your owner's manual. On my machine, I have serger cone thread in my right overlock needle. I have a thicker 12 weight decorative thread that's yellow in my upper looper. And I always call the upper looper thread when I'm doing a rolled hem stitch the money thread, because that's the one that shows the most on the stitching. But for this particular technique, the lower looper thread is going to peek through a little bit too. So I chose kind of a rosy red in the lower looper, and that's the same color as in the needle thread. I have disengaged my stitch finger, which you will do. On this particular machine that has a stitch selector, I am on D to tighten up that tension on the lower looper thread as you normally would on any machine. Usually you turn your lower looper tension up higher on that particular thread. And I have my stitch length on just a little longer than 2, just slightly. But again, you'll experiment with the threads that you're using, because that is a variable setting depending on how thick those threads are that you're using. You want good coverage on your wire, so you may need a shorter thread if you're using some lighter weight. You'll need a shorter stitch length, excuse me, if you're using a lighter weight thread. So I am going to close up the front of my machine, and I have run off a chain just to test it. And again, once you put the wire in, you may want to adjust your stitch length again for good coverage. And then I'm going to show you a little trick for getting some nice texture on the surface of that and kind of a twirly look to the stitch. But this looks like it's going to be pretty good. Now, for this, I have on my beading foot, and the beading foot has this little channel on the right edge of it. And just as you do with wire edge ribbon, the wire that you're covering always has to travel to the right of your needle, because you want the looper and the needle thread to encase the wire. And because this wire stays coiled, it's memory wire, so it remembers that it always wants to go back into that coil. I am going to feed that in on this channel, and I'm going to hold on to my thread tail and the wire in back of the foot when I get started. So, and this is the trickiest part of this whole technique. So I want to get this wire in, and I can let that go for a minute. I'm going to lower my needle just to make sure that my wire is to the right. I have enough of the wire to grab and hang on to in back of the foot. And I'm always, with my left hand and my right hand as the stitches, going to encourage the wire to stay to the right of that needle, simply because I don't want the needle to bump it. It'll break the needle, and then you'll have to start all over again. So I'm going to put my presser foot down, and you want to stitch at a slow to moderate speed just to make sure you've got everything managed. But let's see how this does. And what I'm doing basically with my right hand is I'm straightening the wire out as it feeds along, and you'll see once the whole thing is done, it'll coil itself back up again because it is memory wire. So let's get going. And you can do as long a length on this as you want. It just depends on how many coils you want to put on your bracelet. So I'll just keep going for a little bit on this. But you can see, for the one that has already passed through and been stitched on, you can see the wire is going back to that coiled. I've gone so that this coils around about 3 times. Now, you don't need wire clippers that are quite this heavy, but this is what I could put my hands on first. But don't use your scissors. Just cut the wire, clip it off, and then just finish your stitching on that. Just get that, and again, make sure your needle doesn't hit the wire. So let me just finish off this little end. And then you can, once you're off the wire, just clip your threads with your scissors. That's fine. So we've got this just like this. And I want to show you how to twirl it around so you get those different colors, almost like a candy cane effect. I've got my wire all stitched, and again, you can see with it covered, it goes right back into a little coil. And what I did on the end of the decorative thread is I put just a tiny bit of a super glue on that. A lot of times with the heavier weight decorative threads, I find that the seam sealants aren't quite strong enough to hold it. So I put a little bit of the super glue on, just something that dries clear, and let that dry. But I wanted to show you how to get kind of a candy cane effect with your colors, and this is really easy to do. All you have to do with that is twist your threads. And you get that nice little twirl in your thread colors, and it shows off both that upper looper and lower looper thread color. But if you don't want to do it, you don't have to either. So just to twirl it around, and you can go right down the length of your bracelet and finish that off. And then you might want to slide on beads over the wire. You can do that. You can stitch them on. If you have little charms, or maybe sometimes even little orphan earrings, or if you've got some little vintage pieces from your family that you want to put on, nothing too precious, but you can do that as well and get a nice effect with that. But you want to finish off the wire on the end because you don't want that poking into your skin. So what I like to do is take a bead that looks nice with that, pop it over the end, and then I'm just going to take my little needle nose pliers, and I am going to just bend this to crimp that end and hold the wire on, so you don't get that sticking into your skin. And actually, I think I'll clip that a little bit smaller just so I don't have that end either. You can see there's a little bit of the bare wire at the end, and you don't want that to be scratching your skin. So check out your local craft store for crimping beads and tubes. They're very easy to use, and you can use your little needle nose pliers just to crimp those. Thanks for joining me in Serger Jewelry, Who Needs Tiffany's. As always, you can ask questions and email them to me at gail@gailpatrice.com, and be sure to check out my Serger tip clips on YouTube and press the subscribe button so you don't miss a stitch. Thanks again, and see you soon.